All right, welcome back. And for the second part of this lecture, what we're going to do is talk about the revolutions that happened in 1848. And we'll see that they really swept through Europe during this period. Didn't have a lot of impact. And then what I want to talk about is a pretty horrible time in world history, which is a time period called Imperialism. Okay, so let's move on to 1848. And so you've got the Congress of Vienna, Concert of Europe, all set up to prevent these revolutions. We've already talked about how the fact that it didn't work. You've got revolutions in 1830. You get a whole bunch of revolutions again sweeping this area in 1848. And what really is going on here is that most of them are demanding rights. So again, this is sort of an outflow of the Enlightenment. You've got some places that were spared from this. So I've given you the list here: England, Scandinavia, Russia, and the Ottoman Empire. This whole revolution of 1848 started in Italy. And we haven't really talked about Italy very much, but it was a whole series of different kingdoms. It started in a kingdom called the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, which was in the southern part of Italy. And it's kind of surprising that it starts there because Italy was considered to be, or this part of Italy was considered to be one of the most conservative areas. But a liberal movement got started, and very quickly the Italian government in the Kingdom of Two Sicilies fell. And you get a brand new government and you get a constitution. Now, news of this swept through Europe, and all of a sudden lots of other countries wanted to have their own revolution. So again, France rises up in revolution. It's a pretty interesting one. You've got the king, Louis Philippe, sometimes called the bourgeois king. He was forced to go out of office. And one of the reasons, or one of the ways that this happened, is that he had made a law that forbid people getting together in large groups for political reasons. But what he didn't expect is that people bypassed this by having banquets. So a banquet is just like what we'd have today, get together to eat. In these banquets, they started to discuss overthrowing the king. And this is exactly what happened. So you get a brand new government called the Republic set up. You also have this area called, or section of time in 1848 in France called June Days. Now we've talked about how the French just could not get along with each other, so they started fighting with each other. You do get an election in December of 1848, and they elected Louis Napoleon. So he was definitely related to the first Napoleon. And what's really interesting is that the whole point of this revolution is to get rid of the kingship. By 1852, they have an emperor again. And so it's Emperor Napoleon III. And this, starting from 1852, starts something called the Second Empire of France. So the revolution in France started off again to get rid of monarchy, and they end up just like they did before with an emperor. You also have a revolution in Austria. So remember Metternich, this is where he is from. And of course, he's a conservative. So what happened here is that the Hungarians decided they wanted to be independent from Austria. And the Austrians said, okay. The problem, though, is that the Hungarian new government decided to create a military. And that's when Austria said no, and this led to a big revolution. And as you can see here, so remember Italy, 1848 in January, that starts the revolution. It spreads to France in February, and then in May it spreads to Austria. And you've got the Austrian royal family having to flee because things got really bad. And of course Metternich, he had to flee as well. In Berlin, you also have problems with the king. So the king during this period is the Prussian king William IV. In the end of this revolution, he actually had to create a constitution. So in one respect, the revolution in Berlin or in Austria was sort of successful. You also have another outcome of this revolution, which is something called the Frankfurt Assembly. And I just mentioned that you do not have a modern state of Germany until the end of the 1800s. What the Frankfurt Assembly wanted to do is get all of the German states together to try and become one country. And many states did not want to do that because they had quite a bit of freedom on their own and they didn't want to give that up. And maybe not surprisingly, many of these revolutions failed. So 1848, very important year in Europe where all these revolutions sweep through and nothing really comes out of it, with the exception of Germany with the new constitution that the king had to sign. And this, of course, made him very unpopular with a lot of people. Another thing this led to, though, is that this leads to the rise of nationalism in terms of the conservative category. So it made people think about ethnic groups, their rights, responsibilities, and this will lead to lots of problems. I do want to talk about just these next two scenes about new nation building, in particular, the creation of Italy as a modern state and the creation of Germany as a modern state. So in Italy, you have these movements sweeping through the country. So remember some of the revolutions of 1830. In the 1830s, you have a man named Mazzini. And what he's doing is he's traveling up and down Italy, going to all these different kingdoms and reminding them of their greatness in terms of the Roman Empire. So the Romans, who were Italians, were great, and the modern Italians could be great as well if they just came together. He's got some really interesting ideas, which included giving voting rights to women. Then moving forward, you've got Garibaldi, who is doing the exact same thing. He's traveling through Italy, trying to raise up this idea of a modern state of Italy, which included all of these different kingdoms. Maybe not surprisingly, you've got the French Emperor Napoleon III supporting an independent Italy. Now, again, it's not out of the goodness of his heart. He wants sort of a buffer zone between France and Austria, but he supports this whole movement. By 1860, you've got most of Italy being united. The one area that did not become united with the rest of it was the Vatican. So the Pope during that period refused to have the papal state of Rome join in. He gets slowly squeezed into a small area, which of course becomes the modern day Vatican today. By 1870, you have a single Italy, and they've got a constitution, you've got a constitutional monarchy, and if you remember, that is the mix of a king and a constitution. So in short, that's how Italy was created as a modern state. The creation of Germany is a little more complicated than the creation of Italy. And the prime mover with the creation of Germany as a modern state is Otto von Bismarck. So it's a name you might have heard of. I put up here on the slide, he's the Prussian chancellor in 1862. And what he does is a whole series of wars to create the modern state of Germany. And I actually have a mistake here on the slide. The war with Denmark was in 1864. War with Austria was 1866, so sorry about that. Anyway, he decides to go to war with Denmark in 1864. And what he does is he invites Austria to join in with this war. And it's probably no big surprise. Prussia and Austria together, much larger than Denmark, they won this particular war. Now, Bismarck made the decision to let Prussia get the big chunk of the victory of this. And this did not make Austria very happy. So it sounds like this is something that Bismarck had all planned out. No big surprise, 2 years later in 1866, and just remember the dates are here wrong, the war with Austria happened. So Austria declared war on Prussia because they were upset they didn't get the spoils of this war in 1864 against Denmark. So you've got a war with Austria. Prussia wins this war. And Prussia, in the peace treaty that followed, said that it wouldn't take territory from Austria. So he tried to make the Austrians happy, but he did say in any future conflict, Austria had to stay out of it. So they couldn't pick sides. So Austria agreed with this. And then you've got a war with France. This is called the Franco-Prussian War. This happened in 1870. And France was defeated. France really got the short end of the stick out of this. So either way, in 1871, you've got an independent Germany for the very first time. You've got a king, King William I. He ends up becoming emperor of Germany, and France then had to pay for this. So remember we talked about indemnities, where it's a payment that usually the one who starts the war has to pay. It wasn't the case for this one. France had to pay a massive indemnity to Germany, They also lost territory. So if you look on this map here, just at the border of France where it says Lorraine and Alsace, that area was taken away from France and given to modern-day Germany. And the reason it was taken away is because the Germans said they're German speakers there. It also acted as a little bit of a buffer zone. But anyway, France was defeated in this war. They did not like this at all. So, and they swore revenge. And this is going to come out again in World War I about what happened during this creation of Germany. Some other things happening about the same time period. So Hungary becomes autonomous in 1867. Remember, we already talked about how this led to a revolution earlier in 1848, but they do get their independence. Bulgaria becomes independent as well. Now, when Bulgaria became independent, they took over a huge amount of territory, and many European countries didn't like this because Bulgaria was tied with Russia. And so you've got this meeting called the Congress of Berlin, which we'll talk about in just a bit, where the European countries told Russia that Bulgaria had to become smaller, and this is exactly what happened. A little bit later than the period we're talking about, but definitely related to this, is that in 1905, Norway and Sweden divorced each other. And remember, we talked about how you've got Norway and Sweden being thrown together. Again, two different ethnic groups. They wanted to become separate, and in 1905 they finally get this. And it's really bloodless. As I put here, they just divorced each other and became separate countries. Now what I'm going to do is talk about a pretty horrible time in human history, and that is something called imperialism. So as I put up here, it was helped by the Second Industrial Revolution, and I'll have a few slides on that Second Industrial Revolution. We can talk about that again. Imperialism is the takeover of another territory. And as I put up here, this isn't a new idea. You've got England taking over the colonies in North America. You've got the French taking over Canada in the 1600s, and so on. So imperialism is not new. It becomes pretty violent in the late 1800s. So on the next scene of the movie, I'll show you a couple of maps. One is Africa, and one is Asia. But as I put up here, in 1870, you don't really have a lot of colonies by the European powers, but by 1900, almost all of Africa was colonized, particularly by England, Germany, and France. So there's two places that stayed free. One was Ethiopia, and the main reason why Ethiopia was free is because the Italians fought Ethiopian troops and were defeated. And you also have Liberia, which is on the western side of Africa. That remained free. You also have imperialism affecting Asia. So in particular, what we're going to talk about is an area called Indochine. That includes modern-day Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. This was taken over by the French. So again, in the next scene, I've got a map here of Africa, which you can take a look at. And then the scene after that, and you might want to stop the video to look at these, an image of Asia. Here's the map of Africa, and what you should do is stop the video, look at the key down at the bottom to see who is taking over Africa. So light purple is France, the red is Germany, and so on. Here too is a map of Asia, where you can see the dark red, which is England, and the yellow, which was, and the purple, which was French. And we'll talk about what's happening in China in the next lecture. And before I talk about imperialism proper, I just want to go quickly through the Second Industrial Revolution. And you don't have to remember all of these things. The most important thing to remember is how it's tied into imperialism. So you've got the mass production of steel. And I've given you here some numbers about the production. You've got, because of steel, you can now build taller buildings, so you get skyscrapers. And of course, people don't want to walk up more than 6 floors, so you get the development of elevators. You've got synthetic dyes, artificial fertilizers, which were really important in terms of growing lots more food. And of course, today we know it's not such a good thing. We've got poisonous gas, which we'll talk about. It was originally used for fertilizing the ground and ultimately is used as a weapon. And speaking of weapon, you've got the development of dynamite. And I don't know if you realize this, this was developed by a man named Nobel. So you probably have heard of the Nobel Peace Prize. He developed that because he was pretty horrified that people were using his dynamite invention for war. So that's why we've got a peace prize called the Nobel Peace Prize. Here I've got another long list of things that were developed in the Second Industrial Revolution. Again, you don't have to remember all of these. Electricity, of course, was very important. The telegraph and the telephone, extremely important in terms of imperialism, because when these countries came over, they laid telegraph lines and then later telephone lines so that they could control their colonies with almost instantaneous messages. So those are the two most important things on this slide to remember. In terms of importance of inventions, I just mentioned the telegraph and the telephone and how important they were. Not only did they connect the colonies, they also connected the world. So you could now make a phone call to Australia or wherever you wanted to talk to someone instantaneous. Railroads, too, extremely important in terms of the history of imperialism. So if you remember your first industrial revolution, you've got it starting in England, and then you've got the development of railroads. By the 1850s, you've got the English building railroads in India. And with that railroad, they start taking over more and more areas, and it's easier to move troops and easier to move things that the English wanted from India. So railroads were extremely important during this period. Now let's look at the roots of imperialism, or what helped to create this atmosphere of taking over different colonies. And if you remember, think back to previous lectures, especially in mercantilism, very important economic theory in the 1516, early 1700s. This idea comes out again. So of course you've got economic factors. All these colonies, Africa is extremely wealthy, Southeast Asia extremely wealthy in certain things. So this was one drive or one root of imperialism, to take over these areas and use that natural resources. You also have political factors, and this ties in with the next root, which is national rivalries, where England will take over a bit of Africa, and then Germany says, hold on 1 second, we need a piece of Africa too, and then France stands up and says, we need a piece too. So you've got these rivalries between different countries, and it led to big chunks of the world being taken over. You also have this interesting idea that Europeans had to spread Christianity to people who didn't have it. So in some of these areas, Jesuit priests in particular went into new areas. They set up hospitals, schools, and then started to spread Christianity. In some places, the natives didn't like this. The native people didn't like this, especially in Southeast Asia, and that led to the takeover of that area. Excuse me. Another thing that was spreading imperialism was that Europeans believed they had the best civilization, and they felt like they had to spread that. So they put up here a moral responsibility to spread their culture. This turns into something called a white man's burden, and I'll show you a little bit of that famous poem in just a bit. But it was believed that the white men had a burden or a responsibility to uplift these people who are not European and teach them European civilization and so on. If you know anything about American colonial history, this is the same thing that was happening with the European or the British and the Native American. They were doing the same thing, they just repeated it during the late 1800s. Another really interesting part of this is Belgium. So Belgium, fairly small country, you've got a man named King Leopold, and he takes over a big chunk of Central Africa and becomes amazingly wealthy. He was also amazingly cruel, which we'll talk about in just a second. We also have another person who made lots of money here, Cecil Rhodes, made it on gold and diamonds, and if you've ever heard of the Rhodes Scholarship, it's named after him. I just mentioned this idea of the white man's burden. You've got a man named Kipling who ends up writing a poem called that same title, The White Man's Burden. So what you might want to do is stop the video and read this little excerpt of it. And what I'll do too is I'll also stick up a tag so you can go read the entire thing. And here's an ad for something called Pears Soap. And as you can see, it mentions the white man's burden about bringing cleanliness to these people in Africa and these people in Southeast Asia. And you can stop the video and read this little part at the very bottom of the ad. Finally, what I've got here is a political cartoon that showed up in the Detroit Free Press, showing a white man carrying a stereotype of an African into a school. So he's walking up this hill, looks like a difficult process, and then you've got the school at the top. Essentially, I have two different types of colonies when they were set up. One is called a settler colony, and that's easy to remember. It's just where settlers come in and live. The other one is an administrative colony, where you don't have large numbers of the people coming in to live. It's just run by an administration. So in terms of settler colony, I've given you here a few: Australia, South Africa, French Algiers, which is in the northern part of Africa. You also have the southern part of Africa, and this was settled by Europeans, by the Dutch, and they're called the Boers. And this happened really early. You've got the Boers arriving in the 1600s. By the early 1800s, you have the English also arriving, and the Dutch decided to move northwards into other parts of Africa, which of course they're Africans there, caused problems for them. But this is called the Great Trek, and they were trying to avoid the English. Ultimately, what happens in Africa is in South Africa, with the coming of the Europeans, the native Africans decided to fight back. And so they created something called the African Native National Congress, which later becomes the South African Congress. And if you know anything about Nelson Mandela, this is the movement that really produced him. So you've got this native uprising. And we'll see this again with India. So the native people just didn't stand around and take what was happening to them. I mentioned French Algiers in the last scene, and this is definitely a settler colony. I've given you a percent here of how much population was actually living in Africa. And of course, remember, this is French, so about 40% of the population were French in French Algiers. I mentioned too, the other type of colony is administrator colony. So one of these is the Belgian Congo, and settled by King Leopold. This was really his private fiefdom. The Belgian didn't really want a colony, didn't quite know what to do with it, but King Leopold made massive amounts of money on this. And he was treating people really badly. As you can see in this picture, lots of people were missing their arms. The reason they're missing their arms is because they had a daily quota. And when they didn't meet the quota of getting their rubber or their palm oil, their arm was chopped off, and then they were sent out to get the same daily quota minus an arm. So Belgian Congo, extremely rich area, palm oil, rubber, ivory. The palm oil and rubber in particular were very important to the Second Industrial Revolution, because if you think about what a car is made up of, you've got rubber gaskets and lots of lubrication and so on. So anyway, King Leopold made lots of money, but lots of people were hurt during this particular period. Germany certainly wasn't going to be left out of this big land grab. So you've got the Berlin Conference, where Germany just stood up, and this is Bismarck saying, we're taking Southwest Africa, we're taking Togo, and we're taking Cameroon. The Germans also took the South Pacific, and this is why you're going to get some fighting between the Germans and the Americans in the First World War in the South Pacific, and it'll lead to issues in the Second World War. I also put up here the Boer War, not totally important, but I had mentioned that the Dutch were in South Africa and the English arrived, and they fought bitterly over this particular area. The most famous administrator colonies during this imperialistic time was India. And again, it's not a settler colony, it's an administrative colony ruled by England. And If you were an Englishman and you wanted to get rich, you went to India to do it, made your money, and then came back to England. Now, of course, just like in South Africa, the Indians did not just sit back and take this. In fact, you've got some rebellions. You've got one called the Sepoy Rebellion, and this happened because the British were trying to form an army using native Indians, and they wanted them to grease their guns using pig grease. And the native Indians didn't want to touch that, and it led to a pretty violent rebellion on the part of England. So lots of Indians were slaughtered during this period. In the 1870s, you've got the very famous Queen Victoria. She takes the new title Empress, or Empress of India. And you can see the numbers here. India was extremely important to England for natural resources. So they had lots and lots of soldiers stationed all throughout India, keeping control of it. And again, remember the railroad. And just like in South Africa, the native Indians got together and formed their own Congress, so the Indian National Congress, and this happened in 1885. This is where Gandhi is going to come out of. So you've got Nelson Mandela coming out of South Africa because of the imperialistic movement, and you've got Gandhi coming out of India because of the imperialistic movement. And you've already seen this slide. This is the map of Southeast Asia. And what I want to do is talk about the purple section. So the section called Indochine, which is an area that France took over. So remember Emperor Napoleon III, he gets involved in this. So the French are colonizing North Africa, and they're also about to colonize Southeast Asia. And one of the triggers for all of this were these Christian missionaries. They were sent to Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, as they're called today, and the native people didn't like it. And Emperor Napoleon forced the Southeast Asian people in that area to accept Christianity, or at least accept the fact that there are Christian missionaries there. In 1867, you've got this whole area annexed, and what that means is they just stood up and said, it's now ours. So you've got the French controlling Vietnam, Laos, and all of Cambodia. So remember, we've talked about Nelson Mandela, we've talked about Gandhi. You've got a man named Ho Chi Minh. So he is Vietnamese, and he rises up against the whole control that the French had, leading to ultimately the Vietnam War. You also have the Dutch involved in Southeast Asia, and if you look at that map, you can see where their holdings are. They never really had direct control, so there's not really a big influence of the Dutch in that particular area today, as opposed to Vietnam, which is highly or heavily French influence. Anyway, with the Dutch, they've got their West India Company. They were more concerned about making money, not necessarily controlling the people or influencing the government and so on. As long as they could make money, they were pretty happy controlling the area. One outcome of this imperialistic movement was something you might call a global economy. So because of the control that the Europeans have, and the Americans were also involved in this, you've got these colonies pulling in huge amounts of wealth, and it ties the whole world together. One negative outcome of imperialism, of course, if you're not talking about the human problem, you've got really what could be termed deindustrialization. And what that means is European powers and the Americans wouldn't allow some of these areas to go into the Industrial Revolution. And if you ever wonder why Africa is called a third world country today, it's because of what happened in terms of imperialism. So the Europeans went in, took this area over, wouldn't allow them to industrialize, which would have given them their own power. And so the effects of imperialism still affects a big chunk of the world today.